salt-soaked crags beneath the lowest foundations. We unearthed that damnable portal of antediluvian evil.
Darkest Dungeon is it's a challenging gothic roguelike dungeon crawler that focuses on the psychological toll of the adventuring lifestyle. And what that really means is that we elevate the importance of your party's disposition and stress levels over their sort of minute min-maxing of their gear stats. We wanted to recreate the kind of experiences you see in survival films and horror films where you take a sort of flawed group of people and put them under an incredibly stressful situation, and the sort of organic storytelling that comes out of that. And of course we've got, wandering crazy dungeons and gear and loot and great combat as well.
So we haven't released, I guess, what your meta goal is, but basically there's a town or a hamlet that's kind of nestled under this ruin that has been corrupted by all these crazy, insane monsters and horrific beasts and otherworldly powers. And so your goal as the player is you basically have to recruit and manage a stable of heroes and send these heroes in groups of 4 down into various parts of the dungeon and the surrounding lands on various quests to defeat monsters and recover relics and things like this. And while playing, you end up building up the ruined hamlet into maybe a little bit more of a vision of maybe how it used to be. And along the lines, you're building up the characters as well. And as Chris said, it's kind of a game about the journeys of the characters themselves and the emotional baggage that they pick up along the way and the psychological trauma. So the loop is you're kind of in town with the heroes, and you go down to the dungeon, accomplish things, come back, deal with your heroes and all the various things that have happened to them, not just training them up, but kind of attending to their mental needs, which we'll get into, re-equipping or maybe changing out your party and going back down. So that's the core loop.
In the game, the characters' stress levels key off pretty much everything. Running across a curio or a trinket can either, fuel one guy's determination or completely mess with another guy's confidence. So they respond differently, and their stress levels are constantly mounting and being alleviated by different things. So, for instance, in combat, landing a big hit might, cheer the party up, and you see the sort of stress numbers come down. Whereas watching somebody get killed or hit really hard in front of you can, conversely stress a nearby party member back up again. So you're constantly managing their sort of stress levels, and an important part of that is camping, resting, positioning your guys, and it's important to note too that it's persistent. So when they get back to town, if it was particularly grueling on one of your characters, they still have like that high level of stress, and that kind of is the lead into the town gameplay, basically.
There is a place beneath those ancient ruins in the moor that calls out to the boldest among them.
Town is a really important part of the game as well. It's not just where you upgrade your characters. That does happen. You get them new gear and you make selections on what skills to upgrade for them, and that goes in terms of your strategy of like how you're outfitting your party. But the kind of cool thing about Town is that's also where you deal with these emotional, that's the hook of the game, with these emotional hangers on their stress level, their quirks, their afflictions. And so shore leave, type of stuff happens. So you bring guys and maybe they need to go, drink a few beers at the inn and relieve their stress. That might be good if a character's not overwhelmingly stressed from the dungeon. A night at the pub may be just what they need. But if they're completely just destroyed and paranoid and freaked out, you might need to resort to stiffer things, like they might need to find religion and spend some time contemplating, spend a few missions off, or maybe they just go on a complete bender, carousing and drinking and gambling, which is great for their stress level, but maybe not so good for the other parts of their character. They might lose money, they might develop a fondness for alcohol, they may contract a disease. These are the sorts of things that can happen in Town. And so that really completes that loop of what happens in the dungeon matters, and and even what your choices in Town end up shaping the character.
We are the flame, they cry, and darkness fears us.
The angle is really, we wanted to sort of take this well-loved genre of dungeon crawling and just shoot it through a different lens. And a lot of times the dungeon crawling cliches or sort of presuppositions that people carry into these games are that their heroes are basically immutable, and health potions at the last minute, are totally acceptable. And their heroes are really just paper dolls to dress in better and better gear. And we just sort of thought, would it be interesting to try and, recreate a dungeon game, but without that fundamental assumption that your characters are impervious to the psychological traumas that they have to go through. Because it doesn't matter how big your shoulder pads are, if you're a coward and you're paranoid, you're not going to be able to take much punishment down there.
So we've got what you see when you're adventuring the dungeon is you have a map view that's part of the panel, and by now we'll have screenshots released so people can kind of look at the screenshot if they want to see that. So you've got a map view, which is a top-down kind of traditional roguelike view where you're journeying from room to room, and in between rooms you've got various things that can happen in the hallways. You can run into abandoned chests and arcane lecterns, and events can happen. And then generally you fight in rooms, but you can also be ambushed in hallways, so you're never quite sure you're safe. And there's traps and all manner of other typical things. And then combat itself, is kind of it's a turn-based combat where you've got your 4 party members, and you'll be lined up, against 1, 2, 3, 4, or even more enemies that are also kind of lined up. So you're sort of lined up, your 4 versus the enemy group. And the turn-based and the tactics are kind of interesting. Basically, we take advantage of that rank positioning to create interesting challenges to solve. So if you tend to have a melee character, that person will be in front, and most of their skills might tend to need to be launched from ranks 1 or 2, and maybe they only hit ranks 1 or 2, but for high damage or high physical damage, that kind of thing. Whereas maybe a ranged attacker, if you've got an arbalist or someone in the back, they can launch from ranks 3 and 4, but hit anyone. So that allows us to create the different roles, like kind of frontliners and snipers and everything in between, and even characters that are versatile and that often move back and forth between the ranks because they have different abilities in different areas. And that's where the player's playstyle can come in a little bit too. Like the Highwayman's a really versatile class, and you might choose to run them up to the front to use his point-blank shot, which is incredibly damaging, but that will expose him to frontline attacks. Or you might tend to move him to the back and and snipe away. But that's also where the situation of the characters comes into play a lot, where if somebody's freaking out, they might, let's say your frontline tank is freaking out, he might run to the back because he's afraid, and now you've got this problem to solve where your crusader's cowering in the rear, and all of a sudden your soft tomb robber is right up front getting just wailed on by a giant skeleton.
The game kind of has like this organic kind of combo system where players, by virtue of their party makeup and their particular skill loadouts, will be able to sort of arrive at and discover really interesting and cool combinations between their sort of party members. One of the classes we've announced, the bounty hunter, his special role is to basically grapple backline enemies and pull them forward, and that'll use his turn, and then you can have a really cool follow-up where your crusader can land his big hit on this really kind of weak back row enemy. So as you play, you're going to kind of uncover these really nice pairings that we've kind of layered into the classes, and through experimentation and hopefully sharing on forums and whatnot, people will be able to kind of swap best practices.
Yeah, all the characters have different abilities, and they're differentiated not only by what they do in combat. So combat's a big part of the game, but obviously we've talked a little bit about town, and we may do a bit more in terms of that being an area where you kind of maintain and upgrade your characters. But also in the dungeon, you've got exploration, and you've got camping. Exploration is kind of the journeying between the different, obviously places in the dungeon, and then camping. And so some characters we've designed specifically to have strengths in those other areas. A simple one is like the tomb robber. They're going to be increased to detect traps, so you might want to put them in the front of your party while you're exploring. And then some are going to be camping specialists, like they might prepare better meals. They might be very good at soothing. We've got a jester who's kind of our take on a really kind of messed up, corrupted bard. We'll be showing that we haven't released the jester yet, the art for it, but it's going to be pretty interesting. So for example, the jester's great in camping, where he breaks out his lute and sings a song, and that's his encouragement skill. that he may be more effective at sort of reducing the stress levels of certain characters. We've even toyed with what we're calling utility classes, which are really extreme to that. Take a merchant where just horrible in combat, just really not good at anything, pretty much just a soft meat shield, and but great at maybe increasing the loot from your dungeon run and helping out around in town and also in camping. I mean, really, the game as a whole, that's one of our guiding philosophies is you have to make the most of what happens, and learning how to do that as the player is the fun of the game. Learning how to take this merchant and turn him into a productive member of the party is one of the interesting challenges you can solve.
Yeah, and at different points in the game, you're going to want to, run a different type of party. If you're running low on gold, then, it might make a lot of economical sense to roll with a merchant, although it's going to be, a little bit more difficult. If your coffers are really stacked, and you're sort of just trying to, power level one of your weaker guys, you're probably going to want to bring your more experienced, real solid tank, real solid damage dealer. So depending on where you're at in the game, your priorities determine your optimal party makeup. And that sort of sandbox approach to the party construction, I think, is really an important and unique part of the game. I would really love to be able to see some Let's Players try just absurd party combos just to see if it's viable, just to see if they can get away with it, 3 merchants and a grave robber just hustling their asses through the dungeon, hoping they don't run into anything too bad. That's kind of cool, and you don't see that too often because a lot of modern games rely so heavily on that sort of tank heals DPS kind of formula. The characters in the game are a big sort of focus and differentiating factor. So everything that happens to them gets kind of tracked, and if they develop a quirk, positive or negative, that sticks with that character until you either take action to try and resolve it via meditation or carousing in the bar. But as you play the different characters, their experience directly translates into permanent, statistical changes in what they're good at. So that's really kind of an important thing because you might want to have a couple of different highwaymen or a couple of different plague doctors in your roster, just as a backup or an alternate. We're really sort of challenging the player to think as a hockey coach where you're managing a team and you got to pull guys off the lines when they get injured and put them into rehab and that kind of thing. The other thing that's important is that, like Tyler mentioned, all these classes are designed with types of combat functionality in mind. So their skills and abilities, you can upgrade and grow them over time, but you don't have to upgrade all of them per character. So you can have a highwayman who specializes in this upfront, blunderbuss, short-range combat, or you can spec him, to be more of a sniper with his dagger kind of hanging to the back. That's just up to you. So what happens to the characters is organic and as a result of your management choices, and there's permadeath in the game, so there's a really high level of consequence for poor decision making. And then also, in town, how you want to take the character. If you feel like you don't have enough back row guys to rely on, then you might want to grow one of these characters in that direction. Conversely, if you're running out of sort of melee DPS or tanks, you might want to start shunting some of these characters in that direction as well.
Yeah, and I should add that the affliction system ties into the character development, both in terms of the quirks that Chris was saying. Quirks is kind of our word for little personality quibbles that people acquire as they're adventuring. So that could be something like a fear of skeletons, or it might be a weakness for for the sauce, for alcohol or something like that. But the afflictions, which are kind of the top level things, when your stress reaches a certain point, and what we call pop. So basically, if the character reaches a stress level that they just can't take it, then it'll tend to manifest as one of our 8-ish afflictions, like things like depression or paranoia, or even abusiveness, where they just go completely the other direction. These are all the ways that humans respond to stress, and characters will kind of develop a predilection towards the way that they respond to stress, just like people do. Characters basically become the combination of whatever skills that you've upgraded for them, the quirks they've acquired, and their affliction leaning, and that creates quite a lot of difference between, say, one highwayman and the next.
One of our big design goals is that no matter how bad it gets, there's always sort of a backdoor of positivity. So, we mentioned that when they hit their sort of max stress level, their resolve gets tested and they can become, horribly afflicted one way or the other. They also have a chance to shake it off, and one of their big sort of positive character points will come forward. So you might have a Crusader, come to his wit's end and then become stalwart and embolden the entire party with a big buff. So we really want to create that sense of like in the last most dire moment, that's when you need like the diving catch basically, and that'll happen, and I think that'll increase the player's attachment to that character. It'll definitely lift the party's mood, and is a nice reversal philosophically from the game design, which is difficult and tragic along the way, and then all of a sudden you get this big sort of boon basically.
The game is kind of, when you go down to the dungeon, it's almost like a little business venture, from the perspective of you want to come out of it with your characters and more loot, than the supplies that you bought going in. And so we do some things like the darkness level is a key mechanic in the game. And that's just basically we have a torch meter, and as you journey through, the torch kind of fades and gets dimmer, and when you camp, that replenishes the torch. But as the torch darkens, it tends to increase the hazards. It makes the monsters a little stronger, but it also increases the loot. So if you're feeling confident and your party's healthy, then you may decide to actually cruise around a little bit in the dark light and get extra loot. And there's even things as you're exploring, we tie that into some mechanics where we've got different darkness levels of corridors, and so you may see, oh, that's a really dark corridor up there, meaning it's going to take the torch meter down faster. Do I want to go for the shortcut that's really dark, or do I want to go maybe the long way around, which is a little brighter and safer? And risk is okay, and we want you to take some risk, and we give you some ways to get out of it if you we don't do things where, for example, you made one bad decision, your whole party is wiped. We made sure to put different mechanics in so that you're if things are turning against you, you can opt to continue elevating your risk. You can double down, double or nothing, or you can kind of get out. So I think a lot of games that deal with permadeath and things like that, where they get frustrating, they work if you felt like you had a choice in what happened.
We don't want that domino effect where you had a couple of bad bounces and then suddenly the whole thing is a mess and there's no way out, and you've lost the investment that you put into provisioning your party, the investment you put into upgrading these characters who are now all dead. We don't want to go down that road. So I mean, you can cut and run, you can drop your gear and just head back to town, and your guys live to fight another day. But we tax you a little bit. They might not feel great about having to flee with their tail between their legs. They might develop a few quirks of cowardice and other sorts of things, a lack of confidence because they had to run out. So we definitely tax you a bit, but it's not a big slap on the wrist. We want to make sure that you can kind of keep moving forward. And I think maybe it's an interesting thing or an interesting time to mention that we don't really have levels for the characters so much as we have resolve, which is based on how often you've used them. So they don't level up where the numbers don't mean anything until they achieve a new level, and then again the numbers become irrelevant until the next level. Basically, every time you run them, they get just a little bit better at coping with stress. So I think that was it's kind of an interesting take, and it really reinforces the central mechanic. So if you keep fleeing the dungeon, your guys are not going to get any better at coping with what's down there. Conversely, if you're an effective kind of player and you're doing quite well and you want to level a new character, you don't really have to grind. You can buy him all the new skills and all the stuff. If you're rich, you can kit him right out. But just like the guy in Aliens, he'll have no experience. So if you take him into the worst dungeon, he has the shiniest, most elegantly crafted sword in all the land, and he'll be sitting there, wetting his pants and crying, and the other three guys are basically going to have to carry him out.
Well, we do, there's some things where, like Chris said, maybe you just have you realize this guy has just the worst combination of negative quirks for what his class is. He's a Crusader and he's afraid of everything and terrified to always go in the front. But really, that's kind of the game space we want you to play in. I mean, no character after a couple missions is going to be free of defects, as it were. And we really don't want you to have characters that are free of defects. That defeats the entire purpose of the game. I mean, we all have defects, and I don't think there's anyone who doesn't. And so we're going to be making sure to design the things in such a way that yeah, it's not a matter of having that pristine party where everything goes right and nobody ever acts out. It's more dealing with the damaged goods. So but like Chris said, if someone's just not good at all, you might be able to cut them. But we're kind of training players out of that mindset of I need to keep my car perfectly waxed, and everything's gonna have some dents.
Well, the game is Darkest Dungeon. We're kickstarting as of February 10th, and we're hoping to sort of deliver a new take on the dungeon crawling genre, and definitely encourage people to come by the Kickstarter page and the website and check it out.